He said.
You need to watch or you give me a sign 3 minutes.
Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah.
No, I mean, he can't, he can't, he doesn't have full mobility. No, he seems to be in fine shape.
Yeah. Well, he was telling me that they were advising him not to travel. Maybe that's
Yeah. Well, he claims he's doing well, and he seems to be. I mean, they're doing their 2-mile neighborhood walks.
Good morning and welcome. It's good to see so many friendly faces, many people that we know very well. This is like a population reunion, so this is wonderful. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, the Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience here at the Wilson Center, and welcome to our book launch and discussion of World Population and Human Capital in the 21st Century. So why this event today? From our perspective, there are 2 reasons. At the Wilson Center, we believe that demographic trends in reproductive health, including fertility, youthful age structures, migration, and urbanization, all play an underappreciated role in global dynamics, including environmental change, climate vulnerability, and state stability. And we hope to increase understanding of those trends for policies and programs. And we have excellent partners in that mission, like our colleagues on the panel this morning, and in particular, USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, who is supporting our efforts in this regard. Second, when I asked Wolfgang and Bill why this book launch, and why should we think about doing this here in Washington, D.C., this is what they said to me. The findings reported in this book, along with associated research being published elsewhere, and you'll also hear a little bit about that today, directly imply a reorientation of social science research, policy emphasis, and international funding in efforts to reduce population growth, improve health, and increase environmental adaptation effectiveness in poor countries. So we're going to be hearing about those various elements this morning. The reorientation is toward I'm going to stop there because that's what they're going to be talking about on the panel this morning. But I wanted to share with you what they said. To achieve these objectives of thinking about how we use these issues for policy and programs will require substantial efforts beyond the printed page. So this is, there's a lot in here, and we want to find very effective ways to sort of get this message out. So this is part of that effort. How can we synthesize what's in here, the very good work that's in here, and think about how it's relevant to our work and our priorities. So I'd like to start by introducing Wolfgang Lutz, who many of us know very well. He's the founding director of the Witterstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital, which is the new collaboration between IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and the WU Vienna University of Economics and Business. And I always feel that Wolfgang is one of these to-go people in our field, and that when Wolfgang speaks, we listen. So I'm going to invite Wolfgang to speak so that we can listen. Wolfgang?
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to present this book here, which was our main preoccupation for the last 3 to 4 years. And I think it's not only thick in volume with 1,056 pages, but also has a very dense content. And I'm happy that Bill is here. The third editor, Samir Casey, can't be here because he's on home leave in Africa. In Nepal, in his home country at the moment. As was said, the Wittgenstein Center has been set up 3 years ago as a collaborative effort between IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. It's a little outside Vienna in an old Habsburg castle, where really there has been this tradition of population projections for the last decades. And Nathan Kiefitz, to whom this book is dedicated, because he would have had his 100th birthday last year, actually was the leader of the World Population Program between 84 and 94. And then there is the Vienna Institute of Demography of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. This is a group of about 40 scientists, one of the leading groups on European comparative demography, and the University of Economics, where I'm also professor of social and economic statistics. So the Wittgenstein Grant, named after Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, which is given once a year to a scientist in Austria, gave me the opportunity to bring these 3 groups together under one umbrella to create a critical mass of global significance. Now I have to learn how to move this. Is it to the left or right? No, it's not moving.
Always a way to keep us on our toes.
Maybe just hit the space bar.
Yeah,
Okay.
there we go.
But then can you put that up here? Then I can hit the space bar without stepping down every time. Cable's long enough?
Maybe
Okay. In any
Benjamin,
case,
you
this book
could-
has 2 unique features that make it really different from other books in the field so far. The one, it really is the most comprehensive scientific assessment of what we know today about the drivers of fertility, mortality, migration, and also education in all countries of the world over the rest of the century. So this is more than 500 pages of this book, really tried to summarize it. And this has 3 elements. The one is there are lead authors, 26 lead authors of the different background chapters that give a state-of-the-art review based on the whole literature in the field and also what they know. And then we have also 46 contributing authors, which are often leading experts in specific subjects that were contributing to these survey chapters. And then we had a major online survey, a questionnaire, where more than 550 international population experts contributed to, and they had to assess in a peer review manner about 150 arguments that are directly relevant for future fertility, mortality, and migration trends. So we didn't ask the experts to just guess what would be the fertility, let's say in Kenya in 2030, but the more were asked to use their scientific knowledge, their evidence-based, science-based views on assessing the validity of arguments that then can be translated into alternative future trends of fertility and mortality. And then we have meetings on 5 continents of so-called meta-expert groups. These are distinguished experts that then were trying to synthesize the above 2 sort of sources of information and help us translate these into numerical assumptions for the population projections. Let's see whether it works now. Okay. So the second main contribution of this volume is the adding of education to age and sex as a main demographic dimension. As you know, up about to 1950, all population projections were made by just projecting total population size and assuming different rates of population growth. And then we started to stratify the population projections by age and sex, looking at the complete age distribution, and now just making another step in adding the education dimension to this. And it matters greatly for 2 reasons. One reason is that education is a very important source of observable population heterogeneity. Almost universally, more educated women have fewer children and lower child mortality, and more educated men and women live longer. So there's this very strong differentiation by level of education. But also, education is very interesting in themselves because it's a crucial determinant of individual empowerment, if you want, but also at the societal level as human capital, as a key driver of development, ranging from public health to economic growth to quality of institutions and even governance and democracy, and even adaptive capacity to climate change, something that Bill will talk about later. Okay, now let's see whether it works. Yes, it does. Now, what does it mean by age, sex, and level of education? This is one of my favorite figures. You probably all have seen an age pyramid, which has women to the right, men to the left, sorted by age groups. And now we put on the 3rd dimension as color. Red means never been to school, no education. Yellow means at least some primary education. Light blue means completed junior secondary education up to age 15, and tertiary education is the dark blue area. So this was Singapore in 1985 when I happened to visit the first time Singapore. And as you see there, I really was struck by meeting 2 different populations, so to say, in Singapore. A class divide that wasn't really a class divide, but it's an intergenerational divide. You have a modern, highly educated and wealthy young population, and an uneducated and poor elderly population. And this is because Singapore has developed so recently. So if we step back to 1970, that's how far our reconstructions go, you see there, just the young people started to get educated, and mostly sort of secondary education. But above the age of 40, almost all the women and most of the men had never been to school. And now I show you an animation going in 10-year steps, how the population of Singapore has changed not only in size and age structure, but also in level of education, and how the more educated young ones move up the age pyramid. So that's 1980, 1990, 2000. You see now the young ones are really highly educated. And by the way, between 80 and 2000, this is also when the Singapore experienced this tremendous economic growth that we believe is directly associated with the improvement of the education of the younger cohorts. But still in 2000, you have uneducated elderly people there. It takes a while for them sort of to leave the age pyramid. That's what we call also demographic metabolism, how societies change through intergenerational replacements. New generations coming in who are different and move up the age pyramid. 2010, this is today, have about the best educated young cohorts, almost 80% with post-secondary education. Then some projections here, 2020, 2030. So you see, particularly in the East Asian culture and context, highly educated women have few children. That's why the age pyramid doesn't look like a pyramid anymore. And one of the key questions that we face in many European countries as well is whether the higher education of the young ones can compensate for their smaller numbers in terms of economic growth. Now, let's look at education differentials. That is the case of Kenya. In 2010, we have the empirical distribution of level of education, sort of fertility by level of education as it's given by the DHS. You see it ranges from more than 6 children on average for the uneducated to 2.5 for the most highly educated groups. And of course, over time, this is an assumption. We assume that all groups experience some decline and there will be some convergence, as we've seen it in most industrialized countries, and move towards the relative differences stay almost the same, but the absolute differences decline in fertility. Now, we've recently produced a review article in Science magazine where we try to sort of lay out the methodology and the basic rationale for integrating education and population. And I just show you sort of 2 alternative simulations that assuming identical education-specific fertility trends, like just the pattern we've seen before, and then have 2 different education scenarios. And they make a huge difference. So this is the most pessimistic. It's the constant enrollment numbers, no new schools being built in a way. And you see there, because population is still growing, actually the number of uneducated is increasing and there's very little improvement. And in that case, the world population increases already to 10 billion people by the middle of the century. Now the other extreme we call the fast track scenario. This is that most countries in the world start following the Singaporean experience that we've just seen, very rapid education expansion, but assuming the same set of education-specific fertility rates as we've just seen them before. But simply because of the better education you see to the right hand, the population is not only much better educated, but also population growth will be less than 9 billion by the middle of the century. So there's more than 1 billion difference purely due to the effect of education. Why adding education to age and sex? What is the education effect, some may wonder. And I think, and we have a whole chapter in this book, that there are good reasons to assume what we call functional causality from education to health and fertility. We believe that in the social sciences, it is impossible to prove sort of strong causality that we are used to show in the natural sciences. But functional causality means that it is a very robust relationship that is safe to assume for the foreseeable future, and we have a good narrative how it works. So what is this narrative? Well, we go into brain research and go back to Eric Kandel, who got the Nobel Prize in 2000 for his work on memory and brain research. And when you're in a room with him, he usually often says that, well, now we reiterate this point for a second and a third time. Now it's permanently stored in your brains, and when you walk out this door, you're physiologically a different person than when you entered it. And in this sense, every learning experience changes our brains for the rest of our lives, and we are building on this. So there is a real physiological aspect, because sometimes people say age and sex, these are real physiological phenomena, but education is not. Well, it also has this dimension. And what does it do? Well, the enhancement of cognitive skills, we have evidence that we have less risky behavior if you're more educated. We are expanding our personal planning horizon. Very importantly, we are learning better from past damage. And of course, we also have better access to relevant information. We can improve health and our physical well-being. And last not least, education also increases income, and that allows us to purchase more of the goods that we think are necessary for our health. So there is a very important, plausible, convincing causal narrative here, how education affects health and health and fertility. Now we are going in the book into a new field as well. And there was sort of an interesting coincidence that at the time when we were finalizing our projections, also the international global environmental change community started working on a new set of global scenarios. As you may know, there were the scenarios of the IPCC developed in 2000 called the stress scenarios, also by a group in the YASA's energy program, and they only had 2 socioeconomic variables. One was total population size, and the other was total GDP. So population essentially had the function of a scaling parameter for calculating GDP per capita, energy consumption per capita, and so on. Now this new exercise wanted to do better on the socioeconomic side. Although the title says that they really have different socioeconomic pathways that matter both for the mitigative capacity and for the adaptive capacity of societies. So in the end, these projections and these scenarios, as you see them published in the book, are identical to the different SSPs, and what we say the human core of the SSPs, meaning the projections of populations by age, sex, and level of education. Okay, let me now show just 3 of the most important SSPs. This is SSP 2, called the middle of the road, or if you want, the medium scenario. We are currently at above 7 billion, 7.2, 7.3 billion estimated. And you see that currently we have a little more uneducated adults in the world than people with tertiary education. And this is going to change soon. In 10 years, we already have more people with tertiary education than without any education. And this is partly already embedded in the fact that in almost every country, the young are better educated than the old, and demographic metabolism will increase the average education of the population. What you also see here that we are expecting a peak somewhere around 9.4 billion between 2065, 2070, followed by a small decline to around 9 billion. Of course, the further you go towards the end of the century, the more uncertain these projections become, and we can talk later how this is different, for instance, from the new UN population projections. Now, SSP1 is the most rapid development. It is called the Sustainable Development Scenario. Here you have very rapid expansion, not quite as rapid as in Singapore, but almost. And you see a much faster growth of the more highly educated population. The world population would be peaking earlier, maybe in 2055. And actually by the end of the century could fall to below 7 billion, similar to at the beginning of the century. So that is sort of a most rapid socioeconomic development scenario. But then there is a scenario of stagnation, SSP3, where you see the total population increasing to more than 12 billion, and you see not much change in the educational distribution of the world. You see actually an increase in the uneducated population and stagnation in the other proportions. So this is just a spectrum of some of these SSP scenarios and how different human development trajectories look like. But then the SSP scenarios, of course, have many other dimensions that we are not covering here in the population projections. But I should say the economic growth projections that I included, they are now fully consistent with our human capital projections. Because you may know that in 2008 we had an article in Science that was called The Demography of Human Capital Formation and Economic Growth, where we showed clearly how the improvements of education in different age groups contribute directly to economic growth. And there we also made the point that it requires nearly universal secondary education in addition to primary education to bring countries out of poverty. And by the way, I'm very happy to see that now the draft of the new Sustainable Development Goals that are following the Millennium Development Goals, and you know the Millennium Development Goals only had universal primary education. Now the Sustainable Development Goals are likely, it looks from today, that they have universal primary and secondary education as a goal. Okay, this also has impacts on the age structure, and in the book we also introduced some innovative measurements of age, which is not just time since birth, but also what proportion of the population has on average 15 or less years to live, some redefinitions of what is old. And here you clearly see under different scenarios, it's both the shape of the pyramid as well as the educational composition that greatly varies with the SSPs. Now, I want to come to a conclusion, and this is my last slide here. In the book itself, we have a concluding chapter. It's called Epilogue. With education, the future looks different, is the title of this epilogue. But we do not, summarize some of the ways how it does indeed look different, but we are not going into policy. There has been now recently in the September issue of Population and Development Review, another paper called Toward a 21st Century Population Policy Paradigm, or rationale I call it there, and you find a policy brief out there that summarizes some of these points. And since I assume many of you are interested in the policy implications of this, I just summarize a few points. So the main point is that national human resource management for sustainable development, that could be the main paradigm, the main rationale for population policies in the 21st century. Just going beyond the numbers and, if you want, add the quality dimension. And this focus on universal primary and secondary education and basic health, these are the dimensions there. And they would be valid for all countries in the world, not just developing countries, but for shrinking, aging, rich countries as well. It would be fully consistent with human rights. There would be no clash of interests there. And as I said before, it is at the very heart of the MDGs and the likely SDGs. And in particular, we point as a specific focus on female education. Why? Well, it empowers women within the family and within society to exercise their reproductive rights. I mean, there's so much evidence that also women who are classified to have an unmet need for contraception, a big reason for not using contraception is that their husbands or their extended family has objections. Well, if the woman is empowered through more education, she can more easily overcome these obstacles. And then, as I've showed it, female education is a key to moderating rapid population growth in high fertility contexts. It can contribute to poverty education and economic growth, as I had outlined before. And also it increases female labor force participation and productivity, and this is very valid for some of the aging European countries. And last not least, and we don't have the time to discuss it now, but we have a series of studies to show how it can contribute to the quality of institutions, to democracy, and even to the adaptive capacity to environmental change. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. That was an excellent way to kick us off and sort of provide a summary of the book. So I really was quite impressed, as we had talked about this earlier and as you outlined today for us, just sort of the methodology, sort of very thoughtful and deliberate approach to examining these set of issues and then sort of positioning education within the context of demographic metabolism and thinking of that functional causality from education to health and fertility, and a really important framing around how we might be physiologically different and what that might mean in terms of thinking of these connections between education and fertility, and what it means for other communities who are looking at global scenarios around the shared socioeconomic pathways, and then sort of bringing us back to looking at different measurements of age, redefinition of old, and talking once again about universal primary and secondary education and the importance of female education. So very excellent. Thank you. As you know, we are webcasting this live, and I have a colleague who called me from the West Coast yesterday who is planning to come out for the event but has an infection and is not traveling. So I know that she and her husband are looking at us from the West Coast. And one point that she said to me was that assuming that it's a non-oil-rich country, that countries that have 4 children or more on average struggle to develop. They have problems developing, and part of this is tied to the educational system not being able to catch up. What are your thoughts on that statement? Would you agree with that, and how does that fit in with your conclusions from the book?
Well, the relationship between general socioeconomic development and income growth and education and fertility is, of course, a very complex one. They influence each other. And there is, of course, this notion of the demographic dividend that says essentially that if there is an externally triggered fertility decline that opens a window of opportunity where societies then can invest, they need to utilize this window to invest in education and other facilitating factors to increase productivity and economic growth. Well, we recently had last year an article in Demography with the title, "Is the demographic dividend an education dividend?" ? And our answer is yes. Because if we properly factor in the education into the economic growth equations, we can see that increases in education typically become before the decline in fertility, and so simultaneously trigger a fertility decline and an increased productivity of women and general education of all the population. So now what looks like a strong correlation between fertility decline and changing age composition as well as economic growth following, seems to be education triggered both economic growth and fertility.
Great, thank you. I know as we were planning today's event, and I mentioned to a colleague that Wolfgang was going to be here, and that I know that many of you were coming to hear Wolfgang. My colleague said to me, well, a number of us are also coming to hear Scott. So we have the superstars on the panel. Many of us know Scott Radcliffe quite well. He's the project director of PMA 2020 and has a long history with USAID for about 30 years. Many of us know him and interacted with him in his capacity as director for the Office of Population and Reproductive Health, which he directed for 7 years. And Scott is going to provide some additional commentary reflecting on some of the ideas and issues that Wolfgang has shared with us. So, Scott?
Great, thank you, and good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to congratulate Wolfgang and Bill on this work, which represents, as you could see, a massive undertaking involving dozens of experts and a series of consultations and reviews that have made this all possible. Our discipline of demography has come a long way in generating population projections. And the book actually has a nice section that documents that history. And I think as a discipline, we do better than perhaps any other one in forecasting change in the future. But there's a need to continue sharpening our estimates and expanding our thinking. And this effort does just that with a number of important advances. Wolfgang noted the addition of education, and we know how important that is in driving the other dimensions of population growth and change. So this is a key advance, and we all know how important girls' education in particular is. But there's another advance. I should mention that the book is 1,000 pages long, so I didn't read every page, I must admit. But I did skim through it and focused on different sections that were of particular interest to me. And one advance that caught my eye, and Roger Mark referred to it, and that's revisiting the idea of what constitutes old age dependency. And this book develops what I think is a new term, is that right? A new terminology, which is prospective proportion elderly. So rather than accepting that at 65 we all become dependent, as dependent elderly, this takes it a step further and says that it calculates the age at which life expectancy is 15 additional years as the cutoff for old age, which I think is an important advance. And there are many people in the room here, I think, who've reached that age of 65 who still feel they're very productive. And that's becoming more and more true, not just in developed countries, but in the developing world as well. So I think this is a more accurate depiction of what dependency looks like. I also think we need to look at the other end of the dependency spectrum, at the what we call child dependency, which is defined as under age 15 as being the dependent child population, and re-look at that as well. The work that Andy Mason and Ron Lee have done in their national transfer accounts, where they look at age-specific, country by country, age-specific consumption and production, they find that ages of dependency extend easily into the 20s and sometimes even to the early 30s before ages start producing more than they consume. So the idea that the dependent population is under 15 is a gross underestimate, I think, in today's world. It may have been accurate in agrarian societies and when children may have started working on the farm at age 15. It doesn't describe today's experience. Anyone who has children probably know that your children don't become independent at age 15 these days. And that's, again, that's true in the developed world, and it's becoming truer and truer in the developing world as well. So I think the demography field does need to reconsider and update its thinking around dependent ages. I'm just going to make one more observation given the limits of time. And this book covers the century we're in now, or in the coming century. But just taking a longer term view, we know that in pre-industrial societies, that population size, population age structure, population distribution were shaped mainly by mortality patterns, right? The mortality patterns that shaped populations. And with the Industrial Revolution and with convergence around mortality, we know that populations are shaped and distributed, et cetera, mainly as a result of differential fertility patterns. And I think we're now entering a new phase as fertility begins to converge, where the main demographic factor affecting size and distribution and age structure is going to be migration. And when you look through the chapters of this book, it's the section on migration where there's a great deal of attention to the difficulties in projecting populations into the future, population change due to migration patterns, because there are so many factors that affect it. And also we have probably the poorest data on migration than we do on fertility and mortality, which creates additional challenges. So I would say that as we go forward, there's certainly sharpening and improvements we can do across the board in population projections, but I think increasingly it's going to be, the biggest challenge is going to be coming up with better ways of estimating and forecasting migration. And if I look back on my own career, back when I went through graduate school, my main focus was on migration. So maybe I can get back into that field again. But let me stop there. And again, congratulations, Wolfgang and Bill, to a great effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Those are really good comments, and I've just come back from Tokyo in a collaborative effort with our Asia program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where we were meeting with Japanese experts to look at the implications of population aging and what it meant. And it reminded me of the discussions we had, Wolfgang, a couple of years ago, probably 3 years ago, with the Royal Society, looking at sort of the implications of aging, and a lot of discussion about thinking about how you define old age and what it means in terms of production. And these Japanese experts were saying the issue that we were facing is not only people are living older, particularly living longer in Japan, but they're healthy, they're very healthy, and they're very productive, and trying to get a sense of how you deal and manage this. So thank you. I'd like to now move on to our next speaker, a longtime friend and colleague, Jason Bremner, who's the Associate Vice President for Population Health and Environment at an excellent organization, Population Reference Bureau. And Jason is also the Deputy Director of PRB's USAID-funded IDEA project, Informing Decision Makers to Act, under which we at the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Aspen Institute also collaborate with Jason. It's a very strong partnership, and thrilled to have Jason on the panel. Jason?
Thanks. If you could, Benjamin, just pass me would you like me up there or would you like me down here?
So wherever you're comfortable, if you...
I have brief remarks, so maybe if you could pass me the
clicker.
I'll just stay here. Since I'm probably not the reason that everybody came out today to join the panel, but it's really a pleasure to join four people who have served as mentors to me. So I'm thrilled for the opportunity to join the panel and to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience. I'm not gonna sit up here and actually talk about the book because it's 1,000 pages, and I too am just diving into the executive summary. But I think what I'd like to talk about briefly are some of the challenges that we face as we produce these types of new projections in understanding population projections and the assumptions behind the numbers. So I'll make some brief remarks, and perhaps the challenge Bill and Wolfgang in their future work to help us on this endeavor. So population projections, of course, are critical at various scales. We all use them. I look in the room and I know each of you have probably grabbed an estimate, a projection in the last month, 2 months, 3 months, probably 1 week. So you all use them, but so do many others at various scales, at country scale and even lower, at global scales to assess future demands for resources, food, water, energy, services, health and education, economics, as we've heard, jobs, productivity, and infrastructure. So they're critical tools, and demographers use their best tools to develop estimates of future size and composition, as we've heard today. And I think that both this effort that Wolfgang just presented is an impressive step forward in looking at size, composition at every country. He only presented the world estimates here, but they are available for every country. And it's impressive to see this advance. And I think many of you will recognize this graphic coming from the recent Science article, which the UN Pop Division and University of Washington co-authors recently released, and also is a nice step forward in terms of methodology. So great advances forward, but most users are not demographers. I mean, you're all demographers, you get it, almost all of you. There are a few faces I don't recognize, and I don't know if you're a demographer, but let's all couch ourselves in the room today as those who largely understand projections and what underlies them. But many people who don't understand projections use them. And just looking around the internet over the last few days, I have picked up on the way that the recent Science article was released. And you'll see Earth Sky. You hear this on NPR. On the website, they picked it up. You can see the article here, boom, right? That's one way to characterize. But then you see the next one, don't panic. Okay, so these are all results of the recent Science article. And they're, of course, not the only ones. This is all in different media, and the media use projections to characterize the world and issues that we face. But very important reports use projections as well. This is the state of food and agriculture. I believe that October 16th was World Food Day, and it's on the first page of the state of food and agriculture. What do they say? They say population in 2050 will grow to 9 billion. So they're using a number produced by a demographer, and the question is, do they understand what underlies that? And then another example, I hope I didn't freeze here, there we go. This pulled from the Futures website. Thank you folks from Futures. Some nice results here. This is the president of Uganda signing a report on the demographic dividend that also uses projections and uses scenarios. Now, I'm not sure that Museveni understood the projections that were in that report, but certainly a good use of them. So what does this suggest? It suggests that there are great challenges for projection users. Do they understand how different projections are developed? What differentiates high, low, medium? What differentiates the different SSPs or the different scenarios on education, CEN or FT? Do they understand how these are different from one another? So we have these great new projections from YASA and that Wolfgang has presented. The Census Bureau, U.S. Census Bureau, produces projections. UN Pop Division produces projections every 2 years. PRB makes one estimate to 2050 every year. So lots of different ones. How are they different? Do different users understand that? Of course, what underlies the assumptions? The projections are assumptions. And do users really understand the fertility assumptions, which are really the ones that drive change, although now we've added education assumptions to that. mortality assumptions, and even migration assumptions. In 2100, the UN, you go that far out, it becomes so unpredictable, they assume no net migration. Zero. Like, there's nobody moving anymore. Why? Because we don't know what to do with it. So, how many users understand that? So, of course, then finally you mentioned the principle of uncertainty, and how do we communicate uncertainty and encourage others to do so as well? The Democratic Republic of Congo, in the medium UN projections, would have fertility decline from above 5 today to 2.7 in 2050, thereabouts. And of course, there's a great amount of uncertainty in DRC on a daily basis, much less to predict fertility decline. Now, we have to do so for projections, but do users understand that that's not a given and a lot of work needs to take place for that to happen? So improvement of projections is critical, but so is improving understanding. And so your homework, I think, as authors is to not only boil down the book and the projections into an executive summary, but continue to ensure that those who want to use these understand all of the assumptions. At PRB, we're working on this as well. I left a brief on the table outside on understanding population projections, assumptions behind the numbers, and I hope that you'll produce something like this as well, so that not only people understand the policy implications, but the science behind that. And ways that we can do this are to allow people to graph the assumptions. You can simply do something like this in Tableau, something that we created recently, which took the UN numbers and just allowed people to graph the fertility assumptions along with the population projections. And this is something that UN should do on their website, so I hope they're tuning in. You can get the numbers, but you can't graph them. And you would see here that in India, in a high projection up here, the fertility in a high projection goes above today's current level and doesn't fall below current level until 2100. Now, that's unlikely, but you need people to be able to see that so that they then say, is the high assumption make sense? Right? Does it make sense? So I hope that you'll allow people to graph the assumptions behind these numbers. I think that this example from the UN on Nigeria, shows that yes, if you graphically represent these, I think people will start to understand better the principles of uncertainty around fertility assumptions and what that means for uncertainty in the future. And Bill is going to talk about this, but Bill, I thought I'd here plant the seed for you. I think the authors of the book are making a nice step forward in allowing people to do that on a website in this Data Explorer, which I think, so I'm not saying you haven't done it, it's there, but you've got to get in there and you've got to let people know about it so users will start to use that. So a challenge then is to communicate better ourselves about projections. We're scientists and demographers, and we're not necessarily communication professionals, and we need to work with communication professionals to ensure that people who are not technical understand. And then finally, just graph the, provide users with basic graphs so that they don't have to create them themselves and mess them up, right? Because they often do. And then finally, but do provide a tool in which users can visualize all of the assumptions for every country. It's critical, and that will go a long way towards users understanding projections. An example that I think you could see in terms of our work on this is another interactive graphic on our website, which is created by communication professionals, certainly not me. I just kind of said, here's the content I want, and worked with a visualization expert to create an interactive graphic. And so I hope that you all will continue to push that as this great new resource is out so that people use these correctly. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for assigning us some homework and also for helping us with that homework. PRB continues to produce really wonderful practical and tools that we can use right now that have very concrete and specific applications. So thank you. So we go to our next speaker, who also has a long and strong affiliation with PRB, William Butts, who is a senior research scholar with the World Population Program and Director of Coordination and Outreach at the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital. Previously, he was the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Population Reference Bureau. So, Bill, let's hand it over to you. I know Jason has teed it up for you a little bit.
Terrific. Thank you, Roger Mark. And thank you on behalf of Wolfgang and Samir and me, the co-editors of this volume, for sponsoring this launch, this North American or Western Hemisphere launch. We have another coming up in Oxford next month for Europe. But this is the first opportunity here today to really talk about this book, what went into it, what came out of it, and what the implications are. So, Roger Mark, we thank you and your extraordinary program here at the Extraordinary Wilson Center that does so much good. Thanks. Would you hold that book up a moment more? Because I want to introduce Jim Dawson. Hold your hand up, Jim. Jim is the principal editor of this book, substantive, programmatic, scientific editor, as well as a great deal of copy editing also. And we're very glad you're here, Jim. Thanks. Jim and I, for, I don't know, a year and a half or so, shared an office at JASA in the castle, the Schloss outside Vienna. And I think we were the only two Americans there in the program at the time. And we noticed frequently that the door had been locked from the outside. So, but we managed to escape through the other door. I want to spend a few minutes talking about one of the directions of research that goes off of the general approaches that are in the book. At the Wittgenstein Center and at JASA and the Vienna Institute of Demography and the university, scholars have been researching and publishing work on the implications of these projections and the implications of fertility in particular, and female fertility in very particular, on a variety of things, on fertility, on mortality, on migration, labor force, economic growth, and on adaptability to disasters with implications for climate change. And I want to take this last part and spend my time talking about that. And I'm going to be talking about studies, 11 studies that were published in this special issue of Ecology, excuse me, of Ecology and Society that came out a year and a half ago or so. And this is a publication that we at the Wittgenstein Center put together. We commissioned most of the papers, but not all of them. There are 11 papers covering 11 different disasters. Well, here are the takeaways that I hope when you leave that you'll be able to take with you, that people with different characteristics matter, including age, sex, migratory status, where people live, and level of education makes a difference. And there's a lot of knowledge about this. We're not in ignorance about how these things affect outcomes like adaptability and resilience to natural disasters. And there are many experts and many data sources available. In fact, all 26 authors of that book. If you write them and want to have a question, I think they'll answer it. And some of them will answer it right now, but they'll all answer it. And the same is true of the authors of this volume as well. Here's just a general schematic of climate change. And there's three parts to it. The part in the lower left, the part on the left here, characterizes the effects of human populations on global climate change through consumption, technology, greenhouse gas emissions, innovations, all of that. Up here at the top, we have the effects of global climate change on regional effects, on temperature, humidity, extreme events, sea level rise, and the like. Those two parts are much studied, and those two parts are what gets most of the discussion, by far the lion's share of the discussion in policy debates and in policy itself. It's this part that we're focusing on, which is differential vulnerability. That is, how does climate change affect people by age and sex and where they live and their level of schooling? How does it affect them, and how do they respond? How do they adapt or fail to adapt by those things? Whoops, okay. And here's the study. And this study the studies in here are concentrating on that third part. A good deal is known about differential vulnerability or adaptability by poverty level, by age, by sex. We know that old people are differentially affected, children are differentially affected, immigrants, people who live in coastal areas. But very little has been done on schooling. And so that's what we've concentrated on. The studies, the 11 studies, span various types of outcomes, and here are some of them. Risk awareness, that is, in the surveys or in the studies, what is asked that we can study? What are we interested in, knowing what the effects of schooling and age and sex are? Such things as risk awareness and understanding, disaster preparedness, understanding of warning messages, tendency to evacuate or not ahead of the disaster, and then impacts on mortality, morbidity, life, loss of livestock, ability to bounce back in terms of income and wealth. These are the kinds of disaster events that are studied, spanning, as you can see, a good deal. And let me back up and say why study adaptability to disasters? And the reason is what we would really like to study here is adaptability to climate change. That's what we're after. But the climate change that exists is not yet localized enough, with some exceptions, and with before and after data and the kinds of data that you would need. And so we're making a jump of imagination here. We're saying if we can learn how people with different characteristics adapt and respond to disasters and vulnerabilities of a variety of types that we can observe in the data and that have already happened, perhaps we're learning something about how people with these same differential characteristics will react or not and adapt to climate change when it comes. That's about as close, I think, as we can come with the data we have now, and that's the jump that we're making when we make these studies and make inferences about what may happen in the future. Here are the types of disasters that these 11 studies cover. There are various units of analysis from the country level down to the individual level. That is, there are several of these studies that look at country level data and compare what's happened across countries, clear down to the level of surveys, and a number of them have survey data looking at individuals and households. Disaster type, tsunamis, flood, drought, landscape, hurricane, cyclone. So here we have both slow and rapid onset. We have geological, meteorological, hydrological, climatological, and biological disasters. So we're spanning all of these kinds of things in these studies. And the countries really are quite a good sample of low and middle income countries across the globe. Now I'm going to summarize here the evidence that formal education reduces vulnerability. There's mitigation and there are impacts, and you can simply scan over these, but just to pick a couple of them: better access to information and better disaster preparedness. And these studies, many of them are able, over half of them, excuse me, in their samples, are able, in the analysis, to also take account of the respondents' sex, gender, where they live, age, income, and wealth. And so what we've tried to do, the studies directors have tried to do, is to tease out of this the separate role of education. And the impacts are that formal education lowers the risk of mortality, the risk of malaria infection, that's a study from Africa, the lower loss of livestock, faster recovery, and clear down to less likely to adopt coping strategies that reduce human investment, for example, taking children out of school. No one study looks at all of these, but the 11 studies span these different characteristics. And here are just about 7 or 8 of the studies simply characterized here by basically what they indicate, what they show. And they go from community level to country level to individual level and look at, for example, the effects of village levels of schooling, and there's a community level study. And villages with higher mean levels of schooling have lower mortality and animal losses, right here, that one. Down here, in 2004, Hurricane Jeanne led to 2,700 deaths in Haiti, 20 deaths in the Dominican Republic, and 0 deaths in Cuba. One of the studies looks at what role does the education of people have in that, in terms of how the messages were received, how they were understood, and how they were acted upon. And these other studies are other examples of the 11 that, for example, better educated communities keep their income steadier during and after floods and droughts. So that's resilience down here on consumption and income smoothing, a study from Thailand. And Jason, you mentioned Data Explorer, our new data resource. I'm also not going to say much about it, except that it's really extraordinary. It gives you all of the data, not just the data in the last, 600 pages or so of the book, which are country by country by country for almost all of the countries that we analyzed. But you can get the data from all of the countries, and you can manipulate them, and you can download them to whatever you want to use them on. And we think it's an extraordinary resource. So I hope you'll use it. And I guess that wraps that up. And Wolfgang has shown these three, so I'll skip over them. And the takeaways, again, are that people with different characteristics, like age, sex, where they live, and level of schooling, do react in different ways to natural disasters, and can be expected to react in different, and not only different, predictable ways based on research like this. And second, education is one of those things. Research knowledge is there. We know a lot about this. We don't have to plead ignorance on everything at all. There's a lot we know, a lot that is ready for scaling up, a lot that is ready for policy. And here are some go-tos, the special issue, the Data Explorer, the book, and I put my email down there. I should have put Wolfgang's email down there. And I just want to close by saying that over the coming years, over the next 20 or 30 years, billions of euros and dollars are going to be spent on adaptation and mitigation aimed at climate change under the Kyoto Protocol, under national policies. And without some change, by far the lion's share of that is going to be on place-specific infrastructure that can't be moved, that can't adjust very easily to where people move and what people do with their lives and how they behave. And our data suggests that some substantial part of that should instead be redirected to investment in human capital through schooling and through health, which moves wherever people move and is shown to increase their resilience and increase their capacity to react. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's good to see you sort of tie this into our current discussion and systems thinking around resilience and what it means in the context of a world that is changing due to climate. So I think we've had three sets of very interesting commentary building on what we heard from Wolfgang. Scott really focusing on questions around old age dependency and how we think about definitions of the elderly, what it means to child dependency, and thinking about how migration fits in and difficulties in projecting population, taking into account migration. Jason reminding us of the importance of focusing on projection users and how vast an audience that could be, and recognizing the importance of continuing to think about uncertainty and assumptions and what that means for us as we continue to use these numbers and think about the implications of it for policy and practice. And Bill focusing once again on education and the differential vulnerability to disasters and what this means pre-disaster, during a disaster event, and post-disaster. So thank you very much. So I wondered, Wolfgang and Bill, whether you could reflect a little bit on Jason's point earlier when he mentioned how journalists look at these issues. Boom, don't panic. Just this morning, you had a press briefing on the book, and I think we had about 7 or 8 journalists there. And I wonder if you both could share some of your thoughts and reflect a little bit on the discussion that you had this morning. How do you talk to journalists about these issues? How are they attempting to frame it, given the constraints and parameters in which the media must function? Any reflections from your discussions this morning, which I understand were very good? It's always good when you can say we've had a good discussion with a journalist.
Yeah. The topic of population interests almost everybody. Whenever I talk in parliaments or whatever, nobody falls asleep because everybody has been a child, him or herself, or has children, or is afraid of mortality, premature death. So it's a topic that is very close to our lives. Of course, that is an advantage, that there's great interest, but it's also a disadvantage because everybody thinks he or she is an expert in these things and knows all about the determinants and the future trends and so on. So talking in a scientific manner about population-related issues is a true challenge. There is another issue that at the aggregate level, it is sort of a very emotional thing that is fear of population explosion or equally the fear of population decline. I mean, you see alarmist stories going both ways, the huge dangers of population aging as compared to the dangers of population growth, and different people just highlighting different aspects. So what we as scientists, the only thing we can do and must do is sort of provide a well-founded, differentiated picture of what the scientific evidence tells us up to today and what are reasonable science-based assumptions that we can make for the future. And then I agree entirely with you, Jason. We need to think of ways of presenting this in a visual, appealing way, in a clear-cut way, and that's why we're also doing these policy briefs and Data Explorer, where we'll still enhance the visual plotting capacities. Yeah, and then just answer 2 questions. I mean, that's the only thing I think we can be doing.
Great, thank you. Anything to add, Bill?
Well, there's an inherent difficulty in understanding population projections that I think does not come up with other kinds of work that demographers do. And that is, there's usually more than one of them. And so what do you do when you're looking at something and it has those 3, right? Those 3 curves going out. The tendency, and not a bad tendency, is to take the middle one. But another tendency, and a bad tendency, is not to mention that there is uncertainty around that middle one. And to tie that uncertainty back to the causes, to tie the reasons for Jason's 3 forks going out there back to the causes. Why? What's the difference? And what we've tried to do is to be very explicit about that through the mechanism of these scenarios, which are stories about what the future might look like, from a very optimistic one to a very pessimistic one, and several in the middle that really lay out in some detail, not just the assumptions about fertility, mortality, migration, and schooling, but also about how the rich countries of the world will relate to the poor countries of the world, and how the urban centers will relate to the periphery in different countries. These are all in these different scenarios, which are summarized in one chapter of the book. But if you're a user and a journalist, this is digging 1 or 2 levels below that easy graph, that one in the middle that's moving. And I think a lot of the story is lost if people don't do that. We have some journalists here. Jim is a journalist and other things as well, and has helped us a lot to try to communicate these kinds of differences. But it's tough. It's tough.
Maybe one additional comment on this issue of scenarios versus probabilistic population projections, because this has been in the air for quite a while. I mean, as some of you may know, in 1996, we published in the pages of Nature the first global probabilistic population projections under the title Doubling of World Population Unlikely. And then there was a new assessment also in Nature in 2001 under the title The End of World Population Growth, where we have a high probability population growth will come to an end this century. And then there was even a third one in 2008 on sort of the coming acceleration of global population aging. But here we didn't do probabilistic projections, but we went for scenarios, partly because we have this additional dimension of education that is just too complex with currently available assumptions for probabilistic models. We don't have any time series on this data. But also it's a mixed bag. Probabilistic projections help a lot to give a sense of uncertainty in quantifying the uncertainty. And that is very useful. And when going from country to country talking about these projections, I found that in countries where the media publish probabilistic weather forecasts, people have a much easier way of understanding. Like if there's a 20% chance of rain, you don't need to take an umbrella. If there's an 80% of chance of rain, you take an umbrella. So there's an intuitive understanding. In other countries where this is not the case and there's just one weather forecast, it's harder. But the problem with probabilistic projections is that you don't really have policy relevant scenarios. You give some objective distribution and you are not able to show what alternative interventions by politicians or more investment in education or in family planning, what is it going to do? And that speaks for having scenarios that are more closely related to the policy options that are there, to show that these policies would lead into that direction and other policies into another direction. And that is a virtue of these more scenario-based analysis. But so both have their virtue, and it just depends on the purpose.
Thank you, Wolfgang. So Jason, sort of building on of Wolfgang's point about being able to present various policy options. I know this is something that PRB talks about in its outreach and engagement to a variety of audiences, trying to get them to understand and use demographic information. What are some of the key lessons that you think we should bear in mind as we look at Wolfgang's book, which is focusing on implications of the 21st century, in terms of how we communicate around these issues? I know you say we have to continue to work with communicators. What are we consistently doing wrong?
I think Scott mentioned it the other day, and I hinted at it here, and it really comes down to the tendency of everyone to fall to the medium scenario, regardless of if it's probabilistic or if it's scenario basis. People tend to communicate one number, and around the medium projections or a medium scenario here, which I believe you have as SSP2, the failure is to communicate the effort that's needed for even the medium scenario to occur. In other words, as I mentioned for DRC, there's a very healthy amount of investment in human capital, you can call it health and education, that's needed for the declines even in the medium scenarios to happen. And you see it time and time again in the use of projections. The population will be 9 billion in 2050, or there will be 1 billion more people in sub-Saharan Africa in 2050. And I say, like it's a given. And I say, medium projection, if our current assumptions, which have a very substantial amount of investment needed in the health and education sectors, occur. And that's just at, kind of following the current trend. I hope that
that's very helpful.
Clear.
So, Scott, we're particularly interested in thinking of the work that Wolfgang, Bill, and colleagues have been presenting in this book and what it means to us and what it means to our work now. And I wonder whether you could take just a minute to tell us a little bit about PMA 2020 and what are the implications when you think of this work? How would the work that's presented here relate to what you do now? How do you see being able to make that connection?
Okay, thank you. I can talk about what I'm doing these days. I'm directing a project that's called PMA 2020, which utilizes smartphones as a way of gathering household level and facility level data around family planning, and we do some water and sanitation questions. And we recruit enumerators, female enumerators from their communities and train them in how to use these phones to gather data. But we set it up in a way that we can do it more frequently than we can with the DHS. The DHS happens every 5 years. We intend to have the survey repeated initially every 6 months, but eventually every year. So annual updated information. So it will allow us to track progress on a more frequent basis. As often happens, a DHS comes out and we realize we've made progress we didn't expect, or we didn't make progress and we thought we were making progress. And so it's actually a tool for informing programs and policies on a more regular basis, as I said, both with household level and facility level data.
Great, thank you. And I know that most of us know this, but I've learned through working at the Wilson Center and working with security folks that when we say DHS, not everyone understands the same thing. So there's the Demographic and Health Survey, not the Department of Homeland Security, just to clarify. So let's just open up the floor to questions. As you know, we are recording this, so we'd ask you, as my colleagues come to you with a microphone, please give your name and your affiliation and try to get to your question as soon as you can. So we'll start here, and then we come across to them. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Roger Mark. First place, we'd like to really sincerely congratulate you on your efforts to mainstream education within the practice of demography. This is a significant, important contribution, and we thank you for your fine efforts. This book is about 5 pounds, and we like 4.5 pounds of it, but there is a half pound in there that we're a little concerned about, and that's when you attempt to deal with the issue of environmental sustainability. And in this effort, we think you may have fallen just a bit short. In the first place, your discussion about sustainability in Chapter 12 is limited to climate change. And I think we all recognize that the climate change challenge is just one symptomatic problem of a broader causal problem, which is human overuse of the planet's natural resource systems. So, getting to our question, today's reality is that our collective human activities with just 7+ billion people and our current development pathways are already unsustainable in terms of our use of resources. So how can you label SSP1 as a sustainability scenario when there is no attempt to determine if the population of 7.5 to 8 billion people actually can operate within the resource limits of the planet? So it's that connection between your population demographic projections and calling them sustainable projection scenarios that trouble us a bit. Thanks.
And I'm sorry, remind us, who is us? Who are you and where are you coming from?
I'm Ed Berry with the Sustainable World Initiative of the Population Institute.
Thank you. Yes, please, in front here.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz. And one of the impacts of educating girls, which hasn't been mentioned, is the delayed age of marriage, which reduces the effective childbearing number of years. And I'm wondering if you have figures of the age of the mother at first birth and how that correlates to other population figures.
Thank you. Yes, please, we can have a call behind you.
I'm Ishrat Hussain. I'm from USAID, Africa Bureau. I must congratulate the authors for doing really tremendous amount of work and talk about girls' education. And now there is a sort of a convergence. Just last few days, the World Bank has issued a report on voice and agency and empowering women and girls for sharing prosperity. And I think that one can make use of this tremendous amount of analytical work in order to have the policy and program dialogue with the countries, and also a sort of a coalition to mobilize resources for girls' education. So I think that we need to start thinking, the international community start thinking as to how to take advantage of these various pieces of analytical work which are done on a very sound basis and are very convincing to really fast track the actions, because that is where the advantage would lie. I very much agree with what Jason said. I mean, these projections, particularly UN projections, I had a hard time finding out the differences in assumptions. But at the same time, I think there's tremendous advantage in indicating the necessity of doing long-term estimations in development planning. Because right now, I think that's the problem, that the countries do not realize the true implications. And with all sorts of uncertainty, it is important that, that these type of studies highlight the possibilities or probabilities or whatever you can call it. Certainly we should add the assumptions. The other point I would like to make is that here education, I think you could analyze the relationship between education and health. You have already done that in terms of the climate change. But that would then see that the education becomes a proxy for the quality of population. And that will be a tremendous advantage because that has been lacking so far in projections. And you try to fill that gap by talking about education, but education can be a proxy for the quality from different perspectives. And lastly, I would say that you could have analyzed further the inequity aspect, because within the country there are differences in age structure because of the education and the decline in fertility. So the poorer section of society has long history of high fertility, and the age structure looks very different than for the upper income group. And that, I think, is extremely important when we are talking of reducing extreme poverty. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Boy, you packed a lot in there. All right, so let's take that set and then we'll take some more. So we have questions around whether you can really call SSP1 sustainable scenarios, delayed age of marriage, age of mother at first birth, questions around voice and agency and sort of building a coalition to fast-track movement on that, long-term estimations and how useful is that in terms of policy planning, sort of having a sense of what might happen, peer education and health, and looking at education as a proxy for quality of the population, and then questions around inequity. So a short list. Wolfgang, would you like to start?
Thank you.
Before you start, let me introduce Wolfgang on this first question, because Wolfgang has been an integral part of the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so I think is quite familiar with the broader aspects where physical and chemical and environmental scientists are parts of the conversation.
Actually, I was lead author of one of the most difficult chapters, namely the chapter on sustainable development and how this could be conceptualized. And just let me observe two things in this respect. The one is this notion, calling SSP1 sustainable development was not our choice. It was the international consortium of a dozen of global change modeling institutes that selected this name, and our more narrow sort of human core, as we call it, the population projection part, we call it rapid social development. So that is sort of what we can contribute. Is whether or not this is sustainable depends on a much broader set of criteria. As to the book, I also say that this we picked climate change here as one of the prominent examples. But similar scenarios are, of course, used for ecosystems assessment and biodiversity issues. And so the similar tools are useful, but I fully agree that climate change is only one dimension of the issue. As to the issue of delayed marriage, I mean, that's very clear. Yes, it is an important factor. And we also have in what we call sort of the tempo effect on fertility, that if women postpone childbearing, there is a depression on the period measure, the total fertility rate. And we do take this into account. So we have different age patterns of fertility for different educational groups. And so the delay associated with higher education is clearly a significant factor for the lower fertility there. And just maybe on the last point, picking up on the inequality issue. Yes, I mean, that's one of the advantages of not just looking at the mean years of schooling, as many economists capture human capital, but we have the full distribution of educational attainment, where we indeed can see that in some countries, such as India, for instance, there has been an emphasis on high education, tertiary education of some elites, where at the same time leaving large parts of the population without any formal schooling. And other countries, maybe China as an example, have much more initially focused on the universal primary and then junior secondary education, which at some points may have resulted in similar mean years of education of the population, but very different distributions. And we have shown that these distributions actually matter greatly for not only economic growth, but also health and any other dimensions of well-being.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, just on that point, so Wolfgang showed a graphic for Kenya that showed differential fertility patterns for the different education levels. And so that's an example of not just using the mean, but looking at the distribution. And I think it's the case, we talked earlier about the demographic dividend, which is a response to the age structure of a population. And in most countries in the developing world, the transition to lower fertility has already begun, at least in the among the better educated and among the higher income So we often think of the demographic dividend as a monolithic change, but in fact, I think it's experienced by different segments of the population at different points in time. So there are portions of the populations that are already experiencing that dividend, and it's just a matter of when the other poorer educated and the lower quintiles, the lower education or lower income groups experience that change.
It's just about the importance of long-term projections, which I think are critical, and I appreciate that Wolfgang has been doing that for quite a long time, and the UN just more recently releasing to 2100. I think it's critical because in terms of misuse and miscommunication, you'll often see if you only project to 2050 that people assume, regardless of the shape of the curve, they just say the world will stabilize, or population will be, and they don't say and continue to grow or decline. And in fact, in none of the curves that we saw does population actually stabilize. It doesn't stabilize, and so by projecting long term, we see the fact that scenarios move. There's population growth beyond 2050 or decline towards 2100 in different scenarios.
Great. Yes, please.
Thanks for a great panel. Wolfgang, I'm curious. I'm Gary Merritt in blissful retirement. I much admire Yasa's work over the years. I have a concern about functional causality and how that plays out in programming at practical levels in the developing world. Does the book wrestle with the proximate determinants of fertility? That is to say, what we would hope would not happen is that inserting education prominently in there gets translated by policy people into thinking, well, sheesh, we can't do much about family planning and contraception until we get the education level up. Well, we've long known that's not the case. If you look at the replacement level fertility in eastern India, several hundred millions of people, in Bengal, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, these states of India reach below replacement fertility in some instances with very low levels of education. That said, education is a phenomenally important thing. I don't want to suggest dissociation with it. This functional causality troubles me. We know the proximate determinants of total fertility rates, and they don't include education.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I think this is a terrific book. It's a little manic, but it seems to me that it should be a good buy. The fact is that you all are much better at selling your ideas than you are at selling your books. I can't find anywhere where I can buy this. I mean,
So,
There are sheets outside where you can order it for a 30% discount.
so Barbara, I was going to talk about this a little later. There's a flyer out on the table outside from Oxford University Press. You can order it online, and there's a 30% discount off of this. So these are available outside. And then we also have, I know we've talked about the book and the length of the book and the weight of the book. We also have an executive summary, which is much, much easier to handle and get through immediately. And there is also an associated policy brief. So in addition to being able to go online and use the data, and we will also archive this presentation today with the PowerPoint presentation. So we're trying to get this out in as many different formats as possible, and this is exactly why we're having the launch today. So, but yes, you can get the book. Yes, we have a question at the back, please.
Richard Sincata, and I'm associated with Roger Mark's program, Environmental Change and Security Project, and I also work for the Stimson Center. Once again, it's an amazing report, and what's I think people don't realize is how little Wolfgang and Jasa has stood still very long. I mean, you keep moving forward, and I keep hearing from really amazing things that come out of efforts like this. And when I look at at this set of projections, of course, you've moved to a point where you've where population, or I should say, fertility is a dependent variable that is generated from other things, and that's such a breakthrough that it may be hard for a lot of people to grasp how important that is. Secondly, that opens for modelers some big questions, and it's not likely. Maybe it's in the probably everything's in the 2 kilo version of your report, but nonetheless, I'd like to ask it is what happens when you go back to 1970 and you run those relationships and you generate populations, you simulate the populations that are already in place. In other words, if when modelers do that, what they do, that they find, they learn lots of things. They may have to, they find that some countries perform as they thought on average, but that some countries do not, and it opens up all kinds of questions that may be in the larger volume. But I'd like you to, if you can, just talk about what you learned in simulating it, because I'm sure you did. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Again, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm so glad to see that you are working on education. My name's Marilyn Merritt, and I worked for a couple of years as a fellow for AAAS in USAID education, so formed some opinions and experience in that regard. With respect to both of the last 2 comments, I would say, and I would ask you to comment on this, that the formal education thing is, of course, partly a black box, because what does the secondary education in country X compare with secondary education in country Y? There's that kind of a thing. But with respect to something like proximate determinants, where you have, some communication people who are out in the field constantly promoting family planning, et cetera, I think perhaps one thing you probably are hinting at, and I ask for your comment on this, is that the sustainability of the lower fertility rates depends on something that has a more internalized structure at the individual level, which is more likely to come from years of formal education than from just point blank communication, things where you're going around and passing out condoms and family planning things, which can achieve a great deal. And there's no reason to say that both of those things could not work together. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments on this, because I think, using education as a sort of thing is really a breakthrough.
Great, thank you. So some questions around functional causality and proximate determinants, and what are the implications of that for programs and programming and funding. Looking at fertility as a dependent variable and how that relates to modelers who may be simulating population that's already in place. Is that something you've looked at? Yesterday's, yes, yeah. And what is the implications of that? And then the sustainability of the lower fertility levels in terms of years of education. Is it just formal education? And how do we sustain that over time?
Should I start off?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first on this notion of functional causality, because this is really very important. We've dedicated a full chapter 2 in the book to this issue. And we give a very clear definition of what we mean by functional causality. The first is that there needs to be a really massive correlation, association, statistical association. That is a precondition, but it's not sufficient, of course. The second, that becomes more important, then there needs to be a clear narrative, how the one influences the others. And that's precisely where these proximate determinants come in. How education influences the various proximate determinants of fertility. Marriage was mentioned, contraceptive use and abortion and all these proximate determinants. How are they being influenced by the level of education, and what precisely are the mechanisms? And then there is a third prerequisite, that we need to be able to rule out alternative possible explanations. And these are typically reverse causality or selectivity. And we need to really look at this. And we use a lot of literature papers on so-called natural experiments and sort of everything that's available, and that also econometric methods for making sure that we are not looking at spurious correlations, but really having a causal story there. But as I said, in the social sciences, we can never have strong causality, something that under all conditions for all societies at all times is valid. We don't know how societies will change in the future. So functional causality should be sufficient for maintaining the relationship for the foreseeable future, in this case for our projection horizon. Also, the on the proximate determinants, this was a very important topic in this expert questionnaire, where we had sort of the arguments of the drivers of fertility, and there were many arguments on different kinds of proximate determinants, going even to future advances in contraceptive methods and in what direction they could go and how effective they could be. So these are all in there, and partly in the book, but then also in this other paper that recently came out in Population and Development Review, we have a more lengthy section on sort of education and the unmet need for family planning. And there we looked at many of the DHSs of the recent ones have asked what are the reasons, what are the obstacles for women not using contraception when they do not want any more children. And there it was very clear that only a very small percentage of women mentioned that it was lack of supply or high cost. Many more women stated that they were fearing side effects, or their husband doesn't want them, or the extended family doesn't want them. And many of these other reasons, they are actually more related to empowerment of women and than just supply of contraceptions. And then, of course, the desired family size in all the DHS clearly declines with female education. But still, I've come to the conclusion, it just doesn't make sense to try to play the one against the other. Should we invest more in education or more in family planning? Because they very strongly and synergistically come together. If women are empowered through education, they both want fewer children and they more easily find access to contraception. But if they are readily available, it's just the better for them. And the same if contraceptives are available, women who through their higher education have a lower desired family size, they're more likely to use them. So this is a strong synergy, and both clearly should be on the priority list. Okay, as to the other points, the historical thing. Of course, we had many very interesting historical stories. The earliest one that I did was sort of writing a book on the island of Mauritius, which in the 1960s was the textbook example used all over the world as a country trapped in the vicious circle of high population growth and environmental degradation and poverty. And James Mead, who later got the Nobel Prize in economics, took this as an example, and he actually then went to Mauritius, and the British government asked him to make some recommendations, and what he recommended was female education and family planning. This was in the mid-60s. And he convinced Parliament to go ahead, even though there was a strong Catholic Church there, influential in Parliament. They agreed, they did not object to this. And Mauritius had the most rapid fertility decline in the world in human history, until Iran recently had a somewhat steeper decline. And it just worked so well. And if you go to Mauritius these days, it's really the country, they, through these two combined approaches, managed to come out of the poverty trap. Then the next phase was textile industry, then came tourism, and now they are high on high-tech IT, and they are the one country in sub-Saharan Africa, aside from South Africa, who managed to escape from this vicious circle quite well. Korea, Singapore, many other countries have shown that female education came first. After that came family planning and reduction in fertility, and then as this better educated cohort came into young adult age, then came economic growth, improvements in public health, and so. So this temporal sequence is quite important in sorting out the causalities, because by definition, the being in school comes on average 10 or 15 years before then being influential in the labor force. And that helps to sort out the causalities. Good. The last point was, the formal education clearly is only a first proxy. If we want to measure human capital in a broader sense, we want to have the quality of education, we want to have the content of education, but we don't have this information on a global level. We have it for some countries. The OECD has just done a skill study that have this for all the OECD member countries, and we plan to use this. But since our goal was to have a global level study, I think having formal educational attainment is an important first step. It's not the final end. We're going to move more into quality and content. And maybe it's important to say that for basic education, that is sort of our main emphasis here, the content is less important, because it is very clearly just being able to read, write, and count. This basic literacy and numeracy is the most important content that helps really countries move out of poverty. And the content of education becomes more problematic, more difficult when we go to higher education.
Yeah, let me just add to that it is certainly true that the measure of education that we use in this book is I don't even want to call it a proxy. It's what it is. The quality of education is not in there at all. That varies enormously between urban and rural countries, urban and rural parts of the same country, across country, and over time. However, what I want to emphasize is just putting these data together was an enormous task of great difficulty. Just because this variable that we use, reflecting the quantity of schooling, is reported in so many different ways with so many different kinds of errors in different countries, even across some developed countries, that trying to standardize this in a meaningful way so that the data could be compared in the baseline and in the recent history to backcasting across countries was an enormous technical job before we could even start to use this in the model to project all of the outcome variables by age, sex, and level of education.
Maybe just one point on sustainable fertility decline. I just wanted to say that we do know some countries that have had a fertility decline that then stalled over time, but usually when fertility falls, it usually stays low. I'm not sure there are many examples of countries that have experienced fertility decline and then rebounded. And one of there was a time when we all thought that fertility would decline to replacement level and then stabilize there. And of course, we know many countries in Europe and elsewhere now, fertility falls sub-replacement. So one of the challenges, of course, is to figure out, will that rebound to replacement, or what will happen to those countries? And that'll have an effect on population growth in the future. So there are various policies that have been in place to try to encourage higher fertility in those sub-replacement countries. I'm not sure how successful.
Can I respond to this?
Please.
This is a very important question. It's essentially the irreversibility of the fertility transition. And this is an ingredient of what we call the demographic transition theory. And I think the most important summary of this has been made by Ansley Cole, who for many years was head of the Office of Population at Princeton. And he summarized the findings from this big European historical fertility project. And one of his first preconditions for a lasting fertility decline was that fertility must be within the calculus of conscious choice. You need to start thinking rationally about how many children you want, not have as many children as God gives you, but a rational planning. And of course, this transition is very much linked to education, that you have sort of a more rational planning attitude. But once people has gone through this, there seems to be really strong evidence that it doesn't come up, at least sort of to pre-transition levels. I mean, there may be some fluctuations in the band, maybe between 1.5 and 2.5, but it seems extremely unlikely it would go up above 3 again. and even under conditions of extreme poverty again. And let me give you an example that I recently studied. The poorest country in Europe at the moment is Moldova. Guess what the TFR in Moldova is? It's 1.2. These women have gone through the fertility transition. They know how to control fertility. Also, a lot is by abortion probably. And now, as they got poor, and rural Moldavian women are probably as poor as many rural African women who have 6 or 7 children. But why doesn't their fertility go up? No, the opposite, it goes down because they can't afford to have children, but they are used to controlling family size. So that is this once in a cultural history transition. And I think this is at least, of course, you can never sure whether it's a law that holds forever, but it's a very strong hypothesis that has not been falsified so far.
I've got a question.
Yes, please.
This is, I guess, for the authors, that a huge amount of work went into producing these projections. And what's your thought on how often this can be done? I mean, if these are to be useful, then they need to be updated regularly based on new fertility surveys. What are your prospects or your plans for making these useful by updating?
Well, in the past, we have updated our global population projections. These were these 3 rounds of probabilistic projections, on average every 5 years. And we plan to do this in the future again. Of course, there are 2 things that are to be updated. The one is this major expert inquiry and collection of arguments and evaluations. And this need not be repeated every 5 years, and probably cannot be repeated every 5 years, because not so much changes over this course. So maybe in 10 or 15 years we're going to do this again. But in 5-year steps we plan to update them, having new baseline data, incorporating the most recent trends, but still having sort of the main arguments the same.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Simulations.
Yes. Rich's question. The model
What happened when
is
you
simulation.
went and
Okay, well,
verified this, and what were the surprises? Basically?
Yes, I mean, these alternative histories and these things, that's what we precisely did in this Mauritius project, actually. That's why I started to talk about, we had a simulation model that actually was a population development environment model, and we simulated what would have happened to Mauritius if fertility had not declined, or if female education had not increased to that extent, and what feedbacks would have been there. And is this sort of the kind of question you had?
No.
Let's say you have the relationships and you work them out, at least the average relationships between human capital and fertility. Then you go back, maybe you didn't do this, but I do this all the time, and I go back to, let's go back to 1970 where all the data are there, and do it again, and let's see country by country what happened. How well did my model fit? Now I know you must have verified the model in some way, and what you see typically is real surprises that even on a regional basis, some countries do not, some regions and all the countries in the region, most of them do not perform as you thought they should, that on average, and then you might see some extraordinary things regionally or on a country basis that some people talked about, and I wonder what those are.
Well, these associations, as we studied them, of course, are not based on a one-time cross-section. They are based on longitudinal data for all countries in the world where we have them, and national panels. And then if we translate them to individual country experiences, there is, of course, some variation. And the variation is in particular to the extent how fast fertility declines as a function of increasing female education, and also somewhat about the time lag. But we didn't come across any country where female education has increased substantially and fertility has not declined. There has been no deviation from this pattern.
Let me comment a bit more, Rich. Hi. You're asking about what we might call out-of-sample prediction or split sample prediction, in which you estimate the relationships on part of your sample, certain number of countries, and then you see if that works for the other countries historically, or out-of-sample. But to validate it by looking at how the model works in predicting something that you already know the answer to. We haven't done that. We've had a major exercise in what we might call backcasting, which is taking what we know now in schooling and other things where the data is very spotty in the past, and recreating that data with estimates about the past so that that can then feed into our projections for the future. A difficulty, I think, with doing split sample or out-of-sample forecasting here is that the relationships are built on all of our 550 experts' knowledge or translation of scientific knowledge about the future from 2012 and 2013 on. And I'm not sure the assumptions for the split sample prediction would work very well if we took all of that, if we took the model as we have and applied it to the data in 1970 or 1960 or 1980. I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be accurate because we're not asking them to forecast those years. So it's different in that fundamental sense from having a purely statistical model that you can use. But your point is very well taken. One wants to do that. That's the most powerful way of validating. You don't have to wait for, if you can do that, you don't have to wait for 30 years to see how your predictions work out, because you can start in 1980 and see how they worked out.
Maybe an interesting addition to this, I mean, the thing is the relationship is very clear and straightforward with respect to longevity and mortality, because every person wants to avoid premature death of him or herself or of your family members. So if you are empowered to do it, you will sort of try to bring down mortality. When we come to fertility, particularly in the late phases of the demographic transition, we really have to consider two dimensions. The one is how does education affect the desired family size? And the second is how does it affect women's or couples' ability to actually meet their desired family size? And of course, desired family size typically does not fall below 2 or 1, so it somehow stabilizes, because this depends on social norms. Very interesting, in Europe, the social norms are still very strong around the 2-child family. In China, we now see evidence in the cities that their 1-child norm seems to be dominant, and the future generations will just aim at 1 child because they're so much used to seeing only 1-child families. But then, so there's sort of a leveling off, and it does not continue to go indefinitely down to 0, which is the bottom, of course. But when it comes to the ability to arrange your life in a way that you actually meet your desired family size, then again, more educated women seem to be better able to do this. So then for the low fertility countries, really we have to distinguish between these two aspects.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. I think we've had a really good discussion today. There are 3 points that I sort of take away from the discussion. These are not the only points, but ones that stand out to me. Is really, I think as we at the Wilson Center think about how demographic trends continue to be underappreciated when we think about global dynamics, the discussion today has really brought out the educational component of that. How does education fit in? The centrality of education, not exclusively education, but new ways of thinking about how education fits in and why it's important. The second point for me, which gets to the other part of the title of the book, which is looking at what this means for us in the 21st century, is how do we keep pace with change? And we've talked about this in the context of resilience, of climate change, of natural disasters, and other implications. So what does this mean in a changing world, and how do we keep pace with that, and what is the role of demography in that context? And the third point that I take away from this is what is our role of those who are working on population dynamics, reproductive health, family planning, reproductive health services, delivery funding. What does this mean for us in terms of our role? Do we need to be, how do we ourselves keep pace with that change today? So some important implications and some homework for us too. So please join me in thanking Wolfgang, Jason, Scott, and Bill for really enlightening and fascinating discussion. And remember, you can get the book online, 30% off, and we have an executive summary. Thank you so much.